Hey guys, number one Marmaduke fan here. So, I grabbed as many LGBTQ comic books at the library because they were on a shelf as featured items. I said, what the heck, let's grab them and let's see what's going on in the LGBTQ comic book world. I kind of need like a really good manga or a really good indie book like King of Cats to balance these out. Like, because these aren't really fun to read, but they do give you a lot of thoughts. So I would recommend these two books to parents if you kind of want to understand kind of like the post 2016 LGBTQ world, where kind of like pre 2016 everything was about gay marriage, and I think after Obergefell and the legalization of gay marriage, then something new had to become like the key focus for the political left. So one of the things that always has interested me is, why is it that in identity politics, why is there this assumption that you identify as this, therefore you must believe X, when there might not be any relation to that? Like, what does your sexual identity have to do with what you think is true about economics and tax policy, right? And where was I going with that? All right. So the answer to that is like intersectionalism, right? That's where intersectionalism comes in and says, you identify as X. Let's give you a framework through which to look at the world. We take seriously that you're a victim. Now look at the world through the lens that we give you. And if you take that lens, then that means you have to apply that lens everywhere. A worldview isn't just something you can try to apply it willy-nilly. You can try to live your life inconsistently, but eventually people are going to want to try to apply the framework consistently everywhere in life. So if you are all about like the victim and the oppressor in terms of sex, or the victim and the oppressor in terms of race, then you're going to want to use the victim and the oppressor in terms of economics, right? And that's Marxism. So what's interesting about these two books kind of tackle the topic in a different way, in a way that I think that both of them kind of like show two sides of the coin. So The Bride Was a Boy by Chi is clearly targeted at kids in kind of like the simple way it's written. They kind of repeat things, so they'll have like the comic explain a little, thing about being transgender, and then they'll have like a tiny little comic gag and like a few paragraphs written out to explain the terms. And a lot of it is about like, don't use this term, use this term. These different terms have been used. They use LGBTS in Japan because they have their own like Japanese term for it that I wasn't familiar with. So one of the things that comes across is this is kind of the West exporting its values back into Japan. So I had a conversation a while ago that Japan seemed to be a lot more transgressive than Western comics. Like, while Western comics and Western cartoons were hesitant to show gay characters or trans characters, Japan was showing lots of those kinds of characters decades ago. But the new kind of Western, super duper, lefty university culture, they kind of hate that, because what they see what Japan was doing is Japan was saying, oh, this is interesting. These transgender people, they're so unusual. These gay people, they're so unusual. Let's put them in our books because we like taboo and weird stuff. And American kind of like representation in comics is different than that. If you're going to represent a character in your comic or your story, they expect it to not be problematic. They expect it to not reinforce what they consider like harmful or dehumanizing stereotypes, which is where the language comes in. So don't use transgender as a noun, use transgender as an adjective. Gender identity disorder is a common term that's used, but really it implies that they have a disorder, so some people prefer dysphoria. There's societal gender transition and physical gender transition. Do not confuse the term transgender with gender identity or disorder or any of these other terms. Transgender doesn't equal gender identity disorder. Transgender doesn't equal someone who experiences a mismatch between their assumed gender and their gender identity, right? Like, this is a homework book for kids. And often it'll have like the qualification, like there's debate about this, some people don't like this terminology. So there's basically an asterisk that we think you should use these terms, but someone may still call you problematic, even if you use these terms we think you should be using. Sexual minorities. Well, minority seems like an exclusive term. Right? So it's a lot of wondering about language and which phrase we should use to avoid any kind of negative implication. this is a trickle down from kind of like the Judith Butlers of the world. And the thing about Judith Butler is if you try to read her, like, she doesn't know how to construct an English sentence. It's all of these very abstract thoughts stretched on and on and on without a really simplified point to it all, to the point that even like Democrats on Saturday Night Live will make fun of her. But if you kind of dumb that down for a little kid, you just get like a few lists of terms, and these are the good terms and these are the bad terms. Why are these the good terms and these are the bad terms? Well, we can't get into that without getting into all of the semiotics and construction of language stuff. But when they kind of dumb it down for a 6-year-old, that's a lot of, excuse me, cough squad. That's a much better way, I think, to get what they're trying to say than maybe going to the scholars who, write 50 convoluted pages about the subject. So I think this would give, and also like they get married in a Christian church. So that's another illustration of how this isn't really Japanese culture per se. This isn't really in their national character. This is the West exporting our new ideas over to Japan, and some people in Japan then taking those categories and running with it. So it'll be interesting. Does Japan maybe have like a built-in resistance to this stuff because they're not Westerners? They don't have that Western guilt in their DNA or in their thinking that kind of characterizes a lot of students. Like a lot of students are clearly characterized by guilt. They're guilty that they live in a capitalist country. They're guilty that they're white. They're guilty that they're straight, and so that makes the whole framework seem better to them. It's a way of like making them feel like they're forgiven of their sin of being straight and white and American. So will Japan be able to resist that kind of thinking because they're not Westerners, or are they going to be more susceptible to that kind of thinking because they don't have a Christian tradition like America? I don't know. I don't know the future, but The Bride Was a Boy is a good way of kind of thinking through how language is used in LGBTQ issues. Basically, not just to say, hey kids, I identify as a woman, but hey kids, I identify as a woman. Here is the kind of framework or the language you should use to talk about your gender identity. You must assume that gender identity is a social construct. You're not allowed to be transgender and question whether gender identity is a social construct. So that's book number 1. Kelsey Wotton's Cannonball. I actually enjoyed this as I read it because I'm interpreting this as a really brutally honest portrait of just how miserable a lot of millennials are. Like, I love the OK Boomer meme, but Gen Zs actually pull off the OK Boomer meme because their tone of voice when they say it is OK Boomer, right? They're just like laughing a little bit at like the old farts and how old farty they're being. But when millennials say OK Boomer, it's a little bit like more okay, Boomer. Now I finally will stop crying myself to sleep every night and worrying about my student loan. Like, millennials are just a sad sack generation. Oh boy. So one of the kind of the tragic things about Cannonball is this is a kind of the classic story of the struggling artist. I just watched the theater adaptation of John Logan's Red, which is about Mark Rothko. It's a fantastic play about the arts. It's going to get its own video, but basically it's like that classic problem of, if the artist succeeds, does it spoil their ability to kind of make raw and powerful art? If the artist can survive being a starving artist, can they survive being a financial success? Or are they going to have to sell out their principles? But the problem is, since the postmodern age, I don't think we've had any great like upheaval in the arts since the postmodern age, because once you say it's all crap, anything can mean anything, then we're kind of like at the end of cool movements in art or revolutionary new ideas in art. I think we've kind of been stuck in that since the 70s, really. The art institutions feel a little decadent now. They don't feel like there's something new or exciting emerging in them anymore. No one's come along and kicked over the table, but I do think that's coming, but that's for other videos. So what's kind of tragic about the main character is Caroline Bertram. She's just a walking, talking contradiction. She thinks it's a lie that there's this romantic ideal of the artist as struggling and being a genius. She thinks that's BS. But at the exact same time, she thinks she is the walking, talking representation of artistic genius and artistic purity, right? There is like no consistency in what she thinks and what she says and how she acts. Everything is pseudo-ironic. So she'll walk around with a "God is my co-pilot" shirt, ironically, but she talks about how she hates God explicitly in this book. So, and one of the key things is I think that the author, Kelsey Roten, is presenting Caroline's behavior as really destructive, really abusive and nasty, and just full of self-loathing. So because it's portrayed that way, I interpret it as, this is not like, hey, yeah, cool girl, you hate the patriarchy, you hate men, wowsy, you're so strong. This is just like, oh man, it's a tragedy in the sense that I can see how her own thinking is destroying her own life, and she can't escape from it. So here's like, by the way, it's all kind of drawn in kind of like, I guess Tumblr style, like really blocky shapes. I almost kind of think that fits with the subject matter, because I've always thought that SJWs actually could be good characters in a story. You just have to like be honest about how SJWs feel about the world. And this really touched into a lot of like how nasty and just self-important like postmodern art student conversations tend to be. This is a girl, by the way. It took me a while. I'm not sure if it's a boy who identifies as a girl, so they use the pronoun she, or if it's a girl who shaved her head but is cisgendered. I've got no clue. Maybe I'm a bigot even for wondering that. So Caroline has the story of a girl working as a waitress, and she's upset, and she says, I want to do something destructive and wrong. Let that define me. Not this insipid shit everyone swallows these days, working to buy houses to put babies in. And then the other voice says, maybe people do those things because it makes them happy, not because they are stupid. So there is an abject hatred of just normal people having a house and having a family that's looked at as stupid, that's looked at as living like a meager, pathetic little capitalist life. But we, the elite progressive artists, we have been given the higher truth. We live the true and enthusiastic lives because we grapple with the existential tragedy of the universe. And it's just so much like huffing your own farts kind of stuff. Like, it's a really miserable world to live in, where you think you're smarter than everyone else, you think you're a more pure soul than everyone else, you think you're better than everyone else. And what's interesting about this is that Kelsey Roten has the character Caroline arguing with herself. So she says this kind of nonsense, but then there's another voice in her head that says, no, people actually have families because it makes them happy. You're not the smartest person in the world. Not everybody who has a nice little family in the suburbs is an idiot, right? And so first chunk of her story, it's kind of like her struggling, being lazy, not really getting a real job, but like banging out story after story after story, and showing just what a nasty and judgmental person she is to everyone. This is just a long speech where she basically lays out the self-contradiction. She jokes about how, all of these guys, they believe that they're these, tortured genius artists, and she thinks that's just nonsense. Yet, that's exactly what she thinks she is. A lot of complaining about how, like, if you get a regular 9-to-5 job, you're a sellout for the capitalists, and you're sucking their dick, blah, 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 blah. It does kind of run on a little bit. So here maybe like a nice little artistic comment. There's a lot of Piet Mondrian inspiration in the panel layout for the regular book. So red, blue, yellow, little green, black, and white, and lots of geometry. Then, when she switches into Caroline's story, she sort of switches into this German expressionistic Edvard Munch kind of style. And it seems like a really intriguing little story within a story. Like, this girl is exploring one of the moons of Jupiter. There's this gloom or sadness that's infecting the world. And if they stop it and save the world, no one will know that they did it. And Castle is kind of like, it offers you all of these earthly delights. The doors are gilded with pictures of peasants becoming kings. So what I was immediately thinking is, okay, this is kind of like... This is a metaphor for capitalism. Capitalism promises you success, it promises you security, but you must sell your soul in order to make money and make profit in the capitalist culture. At the same time, there's something kind of beautiful about it. This idea that in order to make a sacrifice for someone else, you have to put aside pleasures, you have to put aside earthly comforts in the name of a higher good. So she encounters this sort of like evil satanic figure called like the Grand Magus, and then the book gets nominated for a big award, and Caroline has to kind of grapple with a new problem. She was this struggling, starving artist. She had this bad relationship with her father, who is a Christian, and she's a lesbian, and her father is like... one of the things I want to say about how that was written is her father was kind of like the, stereotypical sitcom homophobe dad, like, I don't like the gays, I'm going to go burn a cross, right? Like that can be annoying, but I actually think it makes sense in this story because part of the point is that Caroline is just an awful, horrible person who can't relate to anybody. So I totally believe that she would have a bad relationship with her father and not be able to relate with her father and kind of like have that same character flaw her father has. That makes sense, right? Like her father calls her a sack of shit, and she knows she's a sack of shit because she always treats people like they're sacks of shit. So she can't even argue with her dad that she's a sack of shit, but that doesn't mean that her dad is an abusive sack of shit too, right? So it's just like endless like misery and sacks of shit being sacks of shit to each other. And then later, Caroline gives an interpretation of her own story. And I want to mark this because I'm going to come back. So Caroline explains that her hatred of God and her father is at the center of everything in her world, which was hinted at earlier. Earlier, she had this conversation with one of her art friends who believes in aliens, and she said, well, I guess believing in aliens is better than believing that we're all just an accident and we're here for nothing, or believing that some homophobe, sexist, racist in the sky formed us out of clay, right? So she's revealing her attitude. Aliens is better than nihilism, the belief that we're just cosmic accidents, we're nothing. And nihilism is better than Christianity. So she hates Christianity so much that those two things become better in comparison to that in her own mind. And you can tell that it's obviously because she has this horrible relationship with her father. Her father is cruel and kind of like gaslights her. So because she has no good relationship with her father, then she hates God. And from that hatred of God comes a hatred of all other people and a deep hatred and hatred of herself, like crying herself to sleep every night. The Magus is like Jesus and my dad and Mickey Mouse. What? He's all these powerful things that seem safe, but they aren't. They want something from you. They want your agency, your ability, your attention. The Magus can siphon the entire world if you let him. We don't gain power or safety by relying on restraint. We only service them. Even if they are kind to us, we serve them. One day their kindness will end, and we will be blamed for whatever happens to us. Their power must be destroyed. So, in her interpretation, Jesus and Mickey Mouse and her father are this. So like Mickey Mouse is kind of like a symbol of, corporate capitalism. I'm all for that. Let's bash on Mickey Mouse and Disney all day. Her dad, who's kind of like this verbally, not physically abusive, but verbally abusive kind of guy who doesn't like that she's a lesbian. And Jesus himself are these horrible kind of like soul-stealing things in her perspective. And then so the devil in her story is Jesus. But the problem is nihilism and postmodernism are exactly that. Her exact problem with Christianity applies to postmodernism. Postmodernism makes demands of you. We must love one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. It is our duty to fight. It is our duty to win, right? Those are moral imperatives. They are telling you must do something. The personal is political is saying that you have a personal obligation to live out certain political principles in your private life, in the bedroom, in what you create. You can't create neutral stories in the personal is political. You must create stories that conform to the intersectional framework, or else you're creating an evil, homophobic, racist, cisnormative culture, right? And Caroline uses all of this terminology. It's clear that she is coded to be the left-wing intersectional college student. So then the tragedy of this is that she sees Jesus as this evil force within her own life, offering her comfort and joy, but really it's just a lie, and all that will do is rob her of her artistic soul or her individuality or something. Now, the reason that's so tragic is why should, in the context of this little story, why should anyone sacrifice the comforts? If, as Caroline herself has said, if the possibilities are ancient aliens, nihilism, and Jesus, why shouldn't I live for my own comfort in a nihilistic universe. And even if I try to live for my own comfort, that's meaningless too. But at least I'll be more comfortable than if I sacrifice or pursue some higher ideal. So this is an entire book about the self-contradiction and the self-loathing in the intersectional framework. I don't even know if it was intentional, but I would say for an older reader, and of course it depicts lesbian acts, it depicts naked bodies, right? So you gotta, read with caution. But this is absolutely like a brutal, gripping, and very authentic portrayal of just how self-loathing and how bitter and how petty and how sad that intersectional view is, where basically hatred becomes the center of everything, and hatred of God becomes the central line through a story that itself actually seems to have a higher moral message than nihilism and postmodernism can offer. It's a real tragedy. I was just sad the whole book. So I have no idea what Kelsey Roten believes. I have no idea, whether this is autobiographical or whether she's just like creating a portrait of a type of character. But together, what's interesting about this is the happy smiley face version of it, and this is kind of the grim, sad, honest, this is so damn miserable, I'm crying every night side of it. So 2 books for adults, read them. This is a very authentic take of like the nasty arts culture. So I'm gonna go read some manga. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. Love you guys. Catch you later.